a nonprofit book publishing company at Columbia University. We bring out six fairly short, very timely books every year. These are works of nonfiction that take on important subjects that are not sufficiently covered by everybody else, so we can make a real contribution. We live as a nonprofit so that we can do this and get these books out is thanks to our many friends as well as people who buy our books. And some of you are on the call. Thank you for your generosity. So let me introduce our panelists quickly, and then we'll start talking about the book and get into some other issues. Samanth Subramanian is the author of this book that we're talking about, The Web Beneath the Waves. He is an Indian journalist living in London who writes widely on a number of subjects and is a great reporter, and also works at a magazine called Equator as one of its editors. Ellie Noam is a professor at Columbia Business School. Ethan Katz-Bassett is a professor at Columbia Engineering School. Both of them are experts on issues the book touches on. Samanth, let's start by just telling us, before we get into the substance of the book, what's the origin story of the book? How did this happen?
Well, that goes quite a way back. I remember around about 2011, I just bought a new iPhone, and on the iPhone there used to be an app called Instapaper, and I would download all these long magazine stories from days gone by, years gone by, and read them at my leisure. And one of the pieces that I was reading was this piece called Mother Earth, Motherboard, which is by the science fiction writer Neil Stephenson, and it was published in Wired magazine in the late 90s. It was a 40,000 word piece, and it was about, the title kind of suggests it. He looks at internet cables running around the world and kind of looks at their patterns, and he imagines the surface of the earth almost as a motherboard, the kind of circuitry being the cables that link places. And I remember being so fascinated by this piece that I was walking out to the grocery store, and I was reading on my phone, and I was reading on my way back because it was just completely riveting, this entire world that had opened up to me of how the internet came to us. And so that was in 2011, and then you fast forward to about 2022, and I started to read these stories about Tonga, which is a country in the South Pacific, where there was a huge subsea volcanic eruption that destroyed the only international data cable running under the sea to this archipelago, which meant that Tonga was essentially sort of cut off from the internet for a period of many months. And this intrigued me as well, because I was like, what is it like for a country, a society, an economy to be offline so comprehensively these days? And I remembered Neil Stephenson's essay, and I kind of started wondering, well, what's changed between then and now? Who controls where these cables go? Who lays the cables? How do they get repaired? And so I thought, obviously, because the internet is now so much more central in our lives and in our economies and livelihoods, that it is sort of much more crucial than it was when Neil Stephenson was writing his piece. And I wanted to write a book that chronicled the passage of that time, the changes that had happened. Maybe some things hadn't changed, and I wanted to find out what those were. And I started off by I start the book off by thinking about Tonga as a case study of a country that is set adrift from the internet and therefore from the globe at large.
Um, Say a little, if you would, about working with us. How did you find your way to Columbia Global Reports? And, we're unusual among book publishers because we send authors places around the world at our expense. So where did you go?
Um, well, so I came to you because of our mutual friend Pankaj Mishra, who I believe recommended my name to you, and I remember Jimmy reaching out and asking if I had any book ideas. And it so happened that I'd been talking about this particular idea with a magazine writer. But then we kind of decided it couldn't be done for a magazine because there wasn't enough space. 5,000 words is too short, really. But also, it would be enormously expensive to go to Tonga or elsewhere. And so Jimmy and Columbia Global Reports came around at exactly the right time, knocking on the door, because I could then sort of pitch them this piece that was really more than a piece. I felt like it really, I wasn't sure entirely that there was an entire book in it. But 25,000 words, which is the length at which you publish, that seemed about right. Your sort of travel budget was extremely, sort of sweet music to my ears. Usually authors, they get in advance and they have to squeeze their travel out of that. I love the fact that you were planning to send me places. And so I went to Tonga, Madrid, Cote d'Ivoire, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia. I think I'm forgetting a couple of places, but I was there. This was a hefty travel bill that I sent back to Nick to approve.
So, just for the completely uninitiated, like the former me, I thought the internet was like traveling through the air in some way. Um, can you just give us a sort of primer on the world of undersea internet cables?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people think that way. And part of it has to do with just the power of words and of the lexicon of the internet that we use in our daily lives. We talk about Wi-Fi and mobile phones and cell phones and the cloud and all these other things, which make us think that the internet is really sort of all around us in the air. It's kind of abstract. Obviously, there is some sort of physical infrastructure underlying it, but we tend to think that it's maybe satellites. But in actual fact, 95% of international data traffic is carried by subsea cables. Uh, you couldn't fill, at this present moment, you couldn't fill Earth's orbit with enough satellites, I think, to take up all the volume of data that we consume on a daily or weekly or yearly basis. And this includes not just emails and Zoom calls, but day trading and NATO's secure communications and Netflix streaming and everything else that happens on sort of a near hourly or minute basis in our lives. And then you multiply that by sort of 7 billion odd people who are extremely online at this particular point in time, and you realize just how much burden these subsea cables carry. And there's between 500 and 550 such cables around the world today, nearly 1 million miles of cabling under the sea, and that kind of like, it's really sort of astonishing to me that these things that lie at the bottom of the sea, quite invisible from our day to day or annual lives, they're the reason why the world works as it is.
Ethan, let me bring you in and ask, um, should I feel very secure and sleep better at night knowing that the internet's coming to me through undersea cables? That's what we call a softball question in journalism.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I think is worth maybe thinking about is most of the internet that you use on a day-to-day basis actually isn't coming to you via undersea cables because the main approach that internet providers, application providers use to get us good performance is moving services close to us. And so if you're in New York now, I assume, or near New York, most of the traffic that you're actually consuming is coming to you from locations near New York. It doesn't actually need to traverse an undersea cable. On the other hand, um, we have I assume Samantha joining us from London now. We have hopefully listeners from around the world. So in that case, there is traffic going through these undersea cables. Um, uh, I think that these are now critical infrastructure. We all depend on it, and um, I think it's this weird contrast in terms of how secure we should feel about it. On the one hand, these are just sitting under the ocean. Anybody who can get under the ocean or any boat that's dragging an anchor across the ocean floor has the ability to disrupt these. And I think that that's one of the things that the book really highlights nicely. Um, the main way we secure ourselves against these or any other internet disruptions is through redundancy. And so in a place that's well connected like the United States or like England, there's redundant cables and that's maybe what lets us sleep at night, that we're not vulnerable to any single disruption. I think one other point that's maybe worth highlighting in this question of Starlink versus undersea cables or satellite versus undersea cables, even if we launched many more satellites, we still really couldn't replace the undersea cables because the satellites are transmitting their communication through the air. And so it would, if we launched more satellites, it would be like all of us trying to shout into this Zoom at the same time. Nothing would really get through undisrupted. And there's just not enough bandwidth available at the spectrum that Starlink and so on use to replace the undersea cables. So the book I read it a while ago, but my memory is that it talks about Starlink being used for emergency connectivity after the disruption in Tonga, and I think it can play that sort of role, but the capacity that's providing is only a fraction of what these undersea cables provide, and so that's kind of the role that they play is long distance high bandwidth capacity.
Ellie, uh, let me ask you if you could go back 30, 40 years in a time machine and redesign the internet based on what we know now, would we have this system? Oh, you're muted.
Uh, that is not a softball question.
I know.
Uh, but I think that actually we got it pretty right. Obviously, at the margin and kind of certain kind of corporate dominance situations and squeezing out of the public from the private. By the private, there are some issues of market power that we kind of did not quite realize at the time. But on the whole, the system that, as Ethan kind of pointed out, the kind of redundancy aspect, which was at the root of the whole packet switching that underlies the internet, which is if something goes wrong, then you just kind of reroute it elsewhere. That we have, if you look at the maps that Samanth showed us here in his book, and the graphs, the routes in 2020, and just 25 years later, the world is crisscrossed by these undersea cables. And if one goes bad by accident, by technology failure, or by sabotage or military action, there's plenty of others that could be used alternatively. And certainly relative to what we had in the past, the communications has become vastly more powerful, faster in terms of kind of capacity throughput, and in particular cheaper. And as an economist, this is really an important point to make, which is we are here now for, kind of located in multiple places, and the audience is everywhere. And even if this had been technologically available 25 or 30, 40 years ago, it certainly would not have been affordable easily. And so it's become a casual, almost free, and in many cases free type service. And people are using it, they're using it extensively, and as they're using it, they change the patterns of their work, of their location. Everything kind of is affected. Think about COVID, how easy it was to kind of work from home, to participate internationally. Now, on the question of vulnerabilities, which clearly is part of the problems that we now kind of have to face with the Iran war, the question then is, compared to what? And what are the alternatives here? And one of the alternatives kind of that we kind of recognize is that we need even more redundancy, just as the pipelines should have been built that would connect directly to the Indian Ocean and directly to the Mediterranean, but they don't really exist at this point quite yet. But there will be in a few years as it's constructed. We need to have more redundancies that if somebody cuts off the cables that underlie the Gulf of Hormuz, that the kind of significant part of the region is not going to go dark.
Ethan, if you could go back and redesign the internet, what would you do, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple questions. One is, if we redesign the internet for today, how might we design it? Another is, did they get the design wrong? And I think the answer to this is actually pretty different. I think if we were going to design the internet for today's use cases, we might prioritize things like security and reliability because we depend on it so much. There's so much critical infrastructure running on it. There's so much commerce running on it, and we all depend on it in our day-to-day lives. If you look back at what they designed decades ago, the basic design of the internet hasn't changed. And the interesting thing is that they prioritized flexibility to support a range of different use cases and applications, and flexibility to support a range of different networks joining the internet, including both networks that they had and conceived of at the time and also future networks. And when you're engineering something like this, you need to make trade-offs and you need to prioritize your design goals. And they did a really explicit and impressive job of that. They were designing for this flexibility. And this is in contrast to something like the old Ma Bell phone network that was engineered to provide performance and reliability guarantees. The internet doesn't provide that. Instead, its highest priorities were flexibility. And in fact, on the list of goals, the lowest one was security, which we might think of as extremely important today. These goals of flexibility can really be in tension with guaranteeing reliability, performance, security, because different applications have different needs. Different networks can provide different things. If you think about the difference between, a desktop computer in an office versus a cellular network and what you get from those. And so it's hard to really define what the reliability and performance goals should even be across this range of applications and across these range of networks. By prioritizing flexibility, the design accommodates a range of applications, it accommodates a range of networking technologies, and this really played a huge role in allowing the internet to grow and morph into what it is today, where we have way more users, we have richer applications than could have been imagined in those early days. And so that I think that flexibility was actually an incredibly smart design choice that played out really well and enabled the internet to become what it is today. But it does mean that resilience and security isn't baked into the design. And so approaches to providing internet resilience depend on redundancy and depend on over provisioning and things like that. And because of this, the internet is both this amorphous thing off in the cloud, but it's also this physical thing embodied in geography. And providing this redundancy can be expensive, and it can be harder in some places depending on factors such as like the local geography. And I think the Tonga example in the book kind of illustrates that there's much less redundancy into there. And so when there is a cable cut in that case by natural disaster, it can really sever things for an extended period of time.
Samantha, let me go back to you and ask you to be specific based on what you saw when you were reporting this book on what are the vulnerabilities other than Tonga. What are some other examples of it?
Well, so for the longest time, the physical vulnerabilities were sort of well known, right? Which is closer to shore. There's ship anchors or fishing trawlers that can kind of damage these cables as they're hitting the seabed. And so the solution to that, right from the telegraphic age, in fact, was for the coordinates of all of these cables to be published and to be in the public domain all the time. This doesn't necessarily apply to what might be called military cables, which have always been sort of, more secret. But by and large, telegraph, telephone, and then internet cables that are for civilian users, their locations were published so that fishing boat captains, ship captains could just avoid those areas altogether. So that was like sort of a mutually agreed upon solution, which seemed to work reasonably well. I mean, obviously, even today, you have upwards of 100 cuts to cables every year, and most of them are accidents caused by ships or fishing boats. But increasingly, this question of sort of malicious damage has come into play, and partly because this reflects just how important the internet is to the economy, so that damaging a cable could be construed as some sort of like act of economic warfare. And this seems to happen more and more often, and certainly governments are more and more concerned about this. In the UK, where I live, there's currently now 2 Royal Naval vessels that are constantly patrolling the waters around the island of Britain to make sure that there's no damage to any of the undersea infrastructure. The government of Taiwan is perpetually paranoid that China is going to cut each and every one of the 15 cables that come ashore in Taiwan. The US is worried about who will snoop on cables landing up on American shores. So it's been a long, long time since a cable was allowed to land in the US that originated in China, for example. The Scandinavian countries are worried about Russia cutting cables in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. And so there's Coast Guard patrols over there constantly. So clearly, this is playing on everyone's fears and imaginations. There's another kind of, I would still call it a danger to the internet as we wish to know it, which is a sort of free and open and fair space, and that is this increasing factor of corporate domination that Eli was talking about. Over the last 5 to 7 years, the 2 out of every 3 cables, new cables that have been laid, have been funded and partly or mostly owned by Meta, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. These are 4 big American tech companies, it's worth saying. It's 4 companies whose CEOs have been in part of this period beholden to a Trump administration, and that's worth saying. These are 4 companies for whom data is their lifeblood. I mean, they live and die by data and data centers and the transfer of data. And in some cases, they also use data for commercial purposes. And so the idea that our data, which we had been giving up to Meta and Amazon and Google and so on for their services, is now also sort of running back and forth along cables owned by them, is some kind of cause for concern. In part because also, I think these companies exert enormous leverage over the technology space. And so for them to decide sort of who gets internet and who doesn't, where cables should go and where they shouldn't, who should be involved in the laying of a cable and who shouldn't, that's sort of an enormous control over the internet itself that we don't talk about as often. We talk about the big tech's control over the internet as algorithms online or social media platforms and so on. But their control over the infrastructure of the internet is equally important.
Ellie, do you want to comment on that issue of the private ownership of these cables by a small number of companies?
Yes, but in just a moment, because first I would like to address the question of vulnerabilities. It is true that there are vulnerabilities to malicious interference under submarine type cable, but compared to what is an important question. If you lay the same cables terrestrially, let's say across Africa, across Asia, they're basically open to almost everybody with a hacksaw or a chainsaw to cut them. So you have to continuously police them and probably in very inadequate ways. If you kind of migrate to a pure satellite-based system, satellites can be jammed. They're also subject to international process of spectrum that can be politicized, a spectrum allocation that can be politicized. And so now, so we basically had a fairly unregulated system, as Samanth mentioned right at the beginning, a fairly unregulated system, and it resulted in an extraordinary expansion of the global capacity bandwidth. Now, much of that was first provided by the traditional system of an oligopoly of state monopolies, which was the traditional system, meaning telecom monopolies in various countries collaborating internationally, co-owning international cable. Eventually, that system became private. Eventually, the largest customers realized that it would be cheaper for them to have direct control and ownership of the cables. This is where Apple and Amazon and Google and so on kind of came into this provision system themselves. And so now, in some ways, they were so successful, too successful in a way, because now they kind of account for a vast amount of the capacity. And that gives them power, for example, at least theoretically, to tell other users of the capacity, you have to conform to our rules on this, on content, for example, or we will not carry you. You have to, certain politics are not allowed. Certain governments we will, or certain countries we will boycott or have sanctions on it. And so there's a kind of an enormous amount of leverage that exists there through that kind of oligopoly plus vertical integration of the system that we exist. And that would lead people to jump in, as is often the case in this environment, and say, there are these problems, they might not exist today, but conceptually they do exist, hypothetically they do exist. Let's do something about them now. And that is the approach that particularly comes out of Brussels, which is the ex ante regulation. If there's a problem, potentially, not real necessarily, we'll regulate it today, make sure that it will not happen. And the US approach, which I think is the more powerful and better one and has been more successful, has been to say, let's kind of see if a problem exists, we'll deal with it then. And it is important as we discuss these problems now, not to jump to some regulatory solution from Brussels or from Geneva, the ITU, that will kind of make the system a lot less dynamic than it is today, which is not to advocate a laissez-faire type approach, just kind of regulate and control when a problem actually emerges.
I want to ask, and I would not be able to answer this question, and I don't know if you all can, but let's see. Everything that is discussed in the book might be pertinent to the war in Iran. There's cables, as somebody noted, running through the Straits of Hormuz. Iran as a country could be, I think, cut off from external contact. What are you guys hearing about that? Is this a potential factor in the war, an actual factor in the war? How should we think about this? And if I'm out ahead of what anybody knows, then we don't have to go there. But
I mean, the potential to cutting your enemy's lines is real and has already been exercised, say, in the Baltic by some kind of shadowy type operation that was clearly kind of fronting for a governmental force. And so clearly that's going to be something that adversaries will exercise. I'm not quite sure what you can, in a way, say other than it's kind of part of warfare. If it affects neutrals outside of the conflict, that's quite regrettable. And so in that sense, everybody should be prepared to have alternatives, not to have their eggs in one basket.
why, I mean, again, we may be speculating too much, but why, if President Trump is not known for restraint, hasn't he already tried to do that?
Well, I mean, if we're talking specifically about the subsea cables in the Straits of Hormuz, those are international cables. They sort of carry data from places in Asia to places in Europe. It's not just the data of Iranian users per se. And I think like um, one of the things about the internet as it is today is it makes it very difficult to go to a particular cable or a particular spot on a particular cable and say, this is where the data of Americans is flowing through. This is where the data of Iranians is flowing through. The way in which the internet routes data is a lot more complicated than that. So for the U.S. government of President Trump to order the severing of cables in Hormuz is to also risk sort of an own goal in one sense, to also damage data that is going to American data centers located in the Middle East. Now, the groups that are interested in doing things like that are groups that are inevitably sort of not, are quite sure that the severing of a cable will have no impact on their own people. So we talk about Russia cutting cables in the Baltic, and that can be done because they know quite clearly that these are cables that don't that run from one non-Russian territory to the other, and that there's no sort of Russian companies that have access to these cables, or in some cases don't draw data from them at all. There was a rumor a few years ago, and there has been again this year, that the Houthis, the rebel group in Yemen, wants to sort of cut these cables going through the Strait of Hormuz as well. And again, the Houthis don't have a kind of constituency of companies that rely on data or the internet. They don't have a constituency of people who are doing sort of high-end tech work, for example. And so it is feasible, although nothing has been proven ever about this, it is feasible that they would want to sort of go ahead and cut these cables. But as an as an act of warfare in a region as complicated as the Middle East, I think it would be, a very delicate and perhaps sort of disastrous operation for either side to decide that they want to cut these particular batches of cables going through the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, I would add to this that probably while the U.S. could identify Iran-specific spurs of cables and cut them off, probably the U.S. and the Western economies as a whole are more vulnerable to counter activities by Iranians or people allied with them. And so it's kind of like unleashing a new style of warfare that might actually boomerang against the U.S.
What's the vulnerability specifically?
Well, the American-based cables, as Samanth just mentioned, the one through the, let's say, Bab el-Mandeb going up there, the Red Sea, or some kind of U.S. cables going to Japan or to Western Europe. It would not take all that great an effort for somebody determined with some scuba gear and similar stuff to kind of to wreak some real havoc.
Right. So the U.S. is more vulnerable actually than Iran is.
The impact on the U.S. economy is much larger than on a less developed economy such as Iran's. They have cut their own internet to their own people already, so their traffic has to be kind of relatively minor at this point.
Right. Okay. So, Samantha, let's go back to your reporting for the book and just if you could tell us in a little more anecdotal detail about some of the places you visited and some of what you saw that stuck with you.
Yeah, I mean, Tonga obviously is sort of the lead case study, if you want to call it that. And, Tonga is sort of an archipelago. And, the main island of Tonga Tapu was itself sort of severely affected, obviously. But the outlying islands were even more affected because they didn't even have sort of any seat of government to look to. And it was quite remarkable how reliant we've all grown on these cables, because the government of Tonga, the Ministry of Communications, had a few satellite phones kicking around for a while, but they hadn't renewed their license or their subscription to the service because they were just so sure that these cables would just last and last and last. They had a kind of microwave signal post on one of the outlying islands, and they had let that sort of slide into disrepair. And the extent, it's very interesting what Eli said just now, which is that the paradox with the internet is a country like Tonga, which is in any case on the periphery of the world economy, has just one cable going out to it. And so the flip side of that is when that cable goes out, Tonga is able to sort of survive in some ways. The entire society sort of doesn't slip into chaos and disorder. But of course, you can see sort of signs of what a lack of internet does. So, a few of the examples I expected. So, for example, hospitals on outlying islands weren't able to send for X-ray images to the main island. They couldn't tap into the database of the health system, so they don't know what your patient records are. ATMs stopped working, and so you can't go to you can't withdraw money, and in a cash economy, that's a big deal. The entire island archipelago sort of runs on Facebook Messenger, and that stopped working, obviously. There were, some disastrous kind of consequences. A couple got electrocuted on a boat, and nobody found them because they were trying to reach them, and yet, obviously there was no There was no cell phone service. Landlines don't work either because these days landline calls also go through these subsea data cables. There was some unexpected repercussions. So I met this one woman who told me that she had lost all communications. All of that happened, but a few days after that, she lost power to her house, and she was surprised about this because she has solar panels on her roof, and she was entirely sort of off the grid. She was self-sustaining as far as electricity goes, and so she kind of poked around on the solar panels, and they seemed fine. And then she found out, like a day or two later, that all of these solar panels, like many other electronics and now increasingly smart cars, they're all hooked up to the internet because they routinely upgrade their software. And if they can't do it, they just sort of break up. And so that's what had happened to her solar panels. They just like stopped working because they couldn't access the internet. It was like an abject lesson in all these things in our lives that are actually connected to the internet, and we just don't recognize them. And in places like Cote d'Ivoire, the story was sort of quite different yet again. I mean, they have three subsea cables. At that time, they had three subsea cables landing up in the country, which is not one, so it's more than one. But Africa is still sort of one of the biggest. Africa has one of the biggest populations that is continually underserved by the internet, and so they are hungry for sort of more bandwidth, more cables to land up on their shores. And an example of what happens when cables get cut to a place like West Africa is that stock exchanges sort of just suddenly stop working. You can actually, people have tried to quantify the economic loss that governments and economies incurred from sort of a few days of cable outage. And increasingly, education is carried out online as well, especially in places where populations are far flung. And so it's not just a livelihood thing; it's an education and learning setback as well if your cables go out. So this was sort of, these are some of the anecdotes that I can remember off the top of my head, and I remember thinking, people have mooted this, of course, in the past, that the internet is now so fundamental to our lives that it should be considered some kind of human right. And I think we haven't kind of recognized that explicitly yet in many places, but you can see clearly what happens when the internet goes out and how sort of your associated human rights, which include maybe the right to learning and the right to a livelihood and the right to healthcare and so on, those degrade as well. And I think that's like really important to keep in mind.
Ethan, I think I missed a cue to ask you to comment on something earlier. Is that right?
Uh, yeah, sure. I can comment on a couple things here. I mean, just to highlight this topic that we were just talking about, I think that one of the real engineering challenges is understanding these dependencies and finding ways to be resilient against them. And that's both this resilience against physical disruptions like the solar panels not working when the internet is disrupted, and it's also reliance on systems. So the rise of cloud providers and large content delivery networks and so on has made it much easier to build applications, but it also has baked in these hidden dependencies that I think are really hard to understand. And it's really hard to understand the disruptions that will occur when parts of the system are disrupted. In terms of physical attacks on infrastructure in times of war, there were incidents like an Amazon data center was disrupted by drone strikes. An Amazon data center in the Middle East was disrupted by drone strikes, and so I had a colleague who works at Amazon who had some late nights working, trying to kind of migrate services away from that. And I think similar to these dependencies, both being physical dependencies, but also kind of logical dependencies on services, disrupting the internet doesn't necessarily require damaging it physically. So um, Ellie mentioned the reduction in internet traffic in Iran, and that's not necessarily due to any physical disruption of a cable being cut. My PhD student, Lachman Salameshion, conducted a measurement study in which he found that Iran's connectivity to the rest of the internet had evolved from having many connections between Iranian networks and other networks to, by about 2019, everything funneling through just a few state-run Iranian networks, essentially creating a choke point. And, I don't know that we know whether that's due to Iran trying to exert that control or whether it's due to external geopolitical pressures pressuring outside networks to not connect directly to Iranian networks, but some combination of these maybe. The end result is that now Iran can be relatively easily severed from the rest of the internet while internal Iranian services continue to work. Um, and we've seen this during the war. There's been weeks on end when that external connectivity has been cut off, and this has real human impacts. My PhD student Lachman, who I just mentioned, wasn't able to talk to his grandmother for the Persian New Year for the first time in his life. And I think when we think about disruptions, it's good to focus on these potential physical disruptions, but also to realize that it doesn't require cutting a cable to change internet access. And what access is available to people in Iran has evolved over the course of the war. So initially there was this kind of complete blackout where people in the country couldn't access external services. Now it seems to be some sort of whitelisting service where certain people can access certain services and so on. I think that gets at this question of internet access as a human right. There might be natural disasters that disrupt connectivity, but there also can be um, government entities or private companies that restrict what people can access.
Um, in a couple minutes, we're going to take questions that audience members have sent in. But before we do that, let me ask each of you to respond to this. So what I think I'm hearing is the system of undersea cables is not in itself a big problem, and I'm not hearing you say we just can't have this anymore because of the vulnerabilities, because everything is vulnerable. And if there's something that's called for here, it's just adding as much redundancy as possible to the system. Am I right to hear that in this conversation? Samanth, why don't you start?
Well, I think redundancy is one aspect of it. And I think like the industry is quite good at planning for that by and large. I mean, I mentioned earlier that we have more than 100 cable cuts a year, most of them accidental, but we don't, proportionately experience the effect of 100 cable cuts every year in our lives, because otherwise we would never be online and we would all be very frustrated all the time. So I think the industry by and large is good at planning for that. I think the thing that it's not good at planning for is what Ethan and Eli have both referred to, which is this aspect of regulation and of sort of making sure the internet is an entity that is not just controlled by a few corporations from one country, that has a kind of freeness and fairness that we were envisioning when we first started. I mean, I am old enough definitely to remember the early days of the internet just about, and I remember sort of the utopian promise of it. And I think we can all agree collectively that the internet these days is like much more of a shit show than we thought it would be. Um, between algorithms and AI slop and social media, obsessions and clickbait and all this other stuff. I mean, the internet is a bad user experience, but it's also, even the back end of it is increasingly proving to be sort of dysfunctional and systemically flawed in many ways. And I think regulating that aspect of it and making sure that it isn't sort of oligopolistic, it isn't entirely in the control of companies from one country. I think that's the more important thing right now.
And by the way, we have a Columbia Global Reports book out, just published a couple weeks ago, on some of what you were just talking about. It's called Reclaiming the Internet by Olivier Sylvain. So you're on the infrastructure and he's on the algorithms and all that stuff, and this is one of the major topics of our time, so we write about the internet a lot or publish about it a lot. I'll ask the other two of you the same question, starting with you, Ellie.
Well, because the societies and economies are dependent on reliable communications, and increasingly so as everything goes digital, and everything is interrelated. it becomes somewhat of a public function to assure that where the markets do not provide such redundancy. So in the case of, let's say, maybe it's an extreme case of Tonga, maybe Tonga, the government of Tonga, or donors, international support system for Tonga, would invest outside of the private sector or subsidize a private operation that would provide such alternative. So I think it is inevitable that it would be considered to be part of the public function of a government is to assure communication links, just as it does in transportation and in financial services, etc., that an assurance of international data flow.
Ethan?
Yeah, I think that the other panelists covered a lot of the key points, but just to maybe highlight a couple of things, I think that a really important point that was made earlier was that if we're talking about vulnerabilities here, you have to consider what the alternatives would be. And I think the takeaway, Nick, that you said that that I don't think that this is undersea cables are a critical part of the internet infrastructure. I don't think that's going to change, and I don't think they're worse than the alternatives. In many ways, they're better. Um, I think that the redundancy that's been built in serves us really well in locations where most of us on the panel are joining from. I think that getting at this point of internet access as a human right, the the tricky thing, especially as the internet has evolved to really be driven a lot by a small handful of large players, is to make sure that we have things that don't leave people behind, people who are in underserved regions. And I think figuring out solutions to provide reliable, high quality internet um, to parts of the world where the internet access isn't available, or it's expensive, or it's unreliable. I think that that's a key thing, and figuring out solutions to do that, and figuring out ways to um, yeah, keep the control from falling into the hands of a small number of corporate players, where I think we've all benefited from the services they've built, but it shouldn't be a complete solution to have them run everything.
And that's even more of an issue when it comes to the retail access type part of broadband, where the satellite providers, the constellations come in, because that's a much more complicated operation to do, and even a smaller set of players has the expertise as well as the resources to do so.
Okay, so now I'm going to read a couple of questions that audience members have sent in. The first is more of a sort of writing process question to Samanth, but it's interesting to talk about. What kind of questions were you asking when you proposed your book to Columbia Global Reports? Did you stick to those questions, or did you drop some of them as you found more intriguing questions as you had worked on this project? And how long did it take for the whole process? So that's the question.
I think initially when I conceptualized the book, I was really thinking of it along the lines of the Neil Stephenson. Like I was thinking of it as an update on the Wired essay from 1999. And I thought like I would sort of stick to the wonkish science and tech questions that I was quite interested in, and sort of write with color from locations around the ground, similar to the way Neil Stephenson did. But then around through the time that I was researching it, the universe sort of helped me out a little bit by making it more relevant in a grim way, which is that you started to see all these reports in the media about deliberate cable cuts, about the worry around deliberate cable cuts, and about how governments were preparing for this. So this angle of sort of security and geopolitics, which has arisen relatively recently in the last 3 years or so, it's become sort of much more central to how people think about it. That started to become more prominent. And so, for example, I hadn't initially planned to go to Taiwan to interview people in the ministry over there. But because this came up, I made a trip over there and kind of talked to them about their fears of China, and about their experience of, or their suspicions that China had already cut two of their cables. So it does kind of like change as you research the book. And I think the whole process took about 2.5 years, nose to tail. Yeah, roughly 2.5 years.
Okay, so now I'm going to read another question, and this would be to everybody. Here we go. In a disruption scenario, for example, a cable cut in the Indo-Pacific or the Baltic, what kind of actor owns the operational authority to prioritize restoration, reroute traffic, or deny access? Would it be hyperscalers, cable consortia, or governments? And where do you see the biggest mismatch today between formal ownership and de facto control? So that's a lot to chew on. Who wants to start?
Well,
I can take it. I can give it to Ethan,
Please,
I
yeah.
think. Ethan, go ahead.
Oh no, I was happy. I was saying that you should go ahead and start. If
Oh, well, I mean, I think one of the things I found that was interesting was so cables, as the questioner has rightly pointed out, often have like sometimes have multiple owners. And certainly they have many clients, right? Because companies in various countries buy bandwidth and they kind of distribute it to their customers. So in the case of Tonga, the cut was from a cable, it was to a cable running from Fiji to Tonga. And Tonga was really the affected party in one sense. Fiji has other cables coming into its shores, but Tonga had this one cable alone. So it was left to the government of Tonga to take action. I mean, the ownership of the cable is not in the government of Tonga's hands, but it is sort of the one of the partners and the main client that was suffering. And so what it does is it then calls up, and I learned this when I was researching the book. The world is sort of divided into zones for practical purposes, and each zone is contracted out to one of the few cable laying and repairing companies around the world. Like there's literally a handful of these companies that own ships that can go out there and either lay a cable or repair it. Once you contract it out for the course of 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, that company will have a ship that is constantly parked in that zone. And it'll kind of be doing repairs and laying work throughout that entire zone. And so the government of Tonga's job at that point was to contact the company that owned that ship. And the company would then kind of dispatch the ship over to repair the cable. In this case, what happened was the ship at that particular moment, the ship was free. It could go out there and survey where the cable break had happened and kind of mark that spot with marine buoys, but it couldn't actually get to the repair itself until 6 weeks later. And at that point, it then had to go to a cable depot, pick up extra cable, come back, lay it, and so on. So the entire process from break to repair took several months. And then there was a domestic cable that got snapped as well from the main island of Tonga out to an outlying island. And that took 16 months to repair. And in that case, it was because there just wasn't enough cable. And the cable had to be manufactured afresh for that job. The factory manufacturing the cable had like a backlog. And, Tonga is obviously, for unfortunate reasons, it's just sort of way down the list of customer priorities when it comes to a company like that. And so it took 16 months for the cable to be manufactured, to be shipped out there, and for it to be repaired. So that's usually sort of how these things work.
Do the other two want to come in on this question?
we can take other questions.
Just to add a quick thing. I mean, I think that's a really good overview of kind of the physical repairs. The other part that's going on is kind of the restoration of services. And so when there is redundancy that's available, companies like the hypergiant large cloud providers migrate services when there's a different place to serve them from that maybe will have more remaining capacity. And services themselves are designed to adapt. So one implication of the internet not having built-in resiliency, reliability, performance is that the way that we get services to work well across varying conditions is to have them adapt. And a simple version of that is we've all, experienced watching a movie on Netflix or whatever it is. And if your internet degrades, the quality of the movie might, come through at a lower resolution, and that's it trying to adapt to the conditions. And so, as much as possible, these services are designed to try to be resilient to changes in capacity, whether the change in capacity is due to cable cuts or flash crowds or whatever other things are going on. And so there's kind of different entities reacting to disruptions in different ways at different layers.
Can I just add quickly? I think that governments should also have some contingency plans, and also make sure that the cable operators that service the country also have some redundancy plan and collaboration plan with other providers in the case of an emergency.
I'm going to read one more question because we're getting close to the end of our time. And here it is. There's a recent article by Thomas Friedman on the threat of private agentic actors to global infrastructure and the mutual benefits of cooperation between China and the US. Do you see that these actors can threaten undersea wires? And if so, what can be done prophylactically to address the threat? Is that clear to everybody?
Yeah. Well, presumably thinking about the problems of of aggressive activist type challenges, kind of agentic type software bots that in a way kind of disrupt the system outside of governments, presumably. And that would be kind of an area of collaboration between countries such as the US and China. Indeed, and yes, just like power systems and air traffic systems, air control systems, these things can be sabotaged through agentic AI type activities.
Anybody else on this question? If not, one quick last one is, and it sort of follows from the previous one, is there some not state actor, legitimate, transnational actor who should be kind of the crisis manager for internet cables and the whole internet system, so that if there's a problem, it doesn't fall to national governments, it falls to X entity?
There's sort of two things that we can point to right now. One is called the ICPC, which is the International Committee to Protect Cables. And that is for the protection of cables. But that is like it's sort of like an industry body. It has no regulatory power. It sets guidelines and companies can choose to follow them. And more often than not, they do. They do a lot of good work. They do a lot of research, but they can't enforce anything. The other interesting thing we should look to here is called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which would presumably pertain, to deep sea cable cuts or deep sea cable laying in general. But again, that it's a fairly toothless body, or it has been rendered fairly toothless for a long time now. I mean, for one thing, obviously jurisdictional issues out in the deep seas are an issue. If you have, I say this in the book, if you have a ship that is flagged in Liberia and captained by a Filipino man and crewed by Indians, and it goes out into the Baltic in international waters and cuts a cable that takes data from Denmark to the UK or Denmark to Lithuania, but the cable is actually owned by 3 different companies in 3 different other countries. Like, what jurisdictions apply here? Like, nobody has really quite figured this out. And this doesn't make, what doesn't make things much better is that the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea was never ratified or signed by the one country that many of the cable owners come from, which is the United States. And so what then do we do? What kind of international regime or what kind of international body do we put together at all when the United States is not a signatory to any convention that seems to limit its freedoms, when the playing field for a lot of these questions is the high seas, international waters, and when the business of cable laying itself is such a deeply international and cross-border business?
We're now right at the end of our time, so I have to wind up. I want to say, maybe this should be in the chat too, if you want to find out more about us, yeah, there it is, globalreports.columbia.edu. That's a link to a donate page if you want to support our work, which I hope you will. You can also, on our site, buy Samanth's book or any other book we've published. And you can even subscribe to all of our books. We'll be having many more books coming out soon that are equally compelling. So, keep in touch with us, and we'll have many more events too. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to do this. It's been a fascinating discussion, and farewell for now.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay.
Thank you, Tulsi.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.